Hello, class. Today we are going to learn about the Performance Diagnostic Checklist, Human Services, or PDCHS. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer the following questions. What is the Performance Diagnostic Checklist, Human Services, or PDCHS? How do you use the PDCHS? How has the PDCHS been used so far? And what are some limitations of the PDCHS? So we're going to begin by talking about what the PDCHS is. It's an informant-based tool designed to identify the variables contributing to poor employee performance in human service settings, such as clinics, schools, and residential facilities. It also provides suggestions for intervention based on the problem area identified. This tool was developed as an adaptation of the Performance Diagnostic Checklist that was developed by John Austin in the year 2000. The Performance Diagnostic Checklist, or the PDC, served the same function of identifying variables contributing to poor employee performance, but it was designed for businesses. So many of the items on the original PDC were irrelevant in human service settings. So James Carr developed the PDCHS, the Performance Diagnostic Checklist, Human Services. Now let's talk a little bit about how we actually use the PDCHS. The first thing you need to do is make sure you have the most updated version of the PDCHS. Then you're going to interview supervisors or employers. Through these interviews, you collect data on a variety of items that we'll talk about in a little bit. But for items marked with an asterisk, you're going to need to confirm with direct observation that that information is accurate. And then you're going to analyze the results that you get on the PDCHS. Every no answered indicates that there is a suggested problem, and every yes answered indicates there is not a suggested problem. And then you're going to develop an intervention based on the results of the PDCHS. So I will walk you through what the PDCHS looks like. So here's the tool. The general information goes at the top, and then you really get into the 4 sections that make up the data collection portion. The first section is training that you see here. These are all questions regarding the training the employees receive for their tasks and responsibilities. The next section is task clarification and responsibilities. These are all questions regarding employees' knowledge of the tasks that they are responsible for and whether they receive prompts to complete the task. The next section is about resources, materials, and processes. This section asks questions about whether the employees are well equipped to complete their responsibilities. And as you're noticing, so the asterisk that it will identify the need for direct observation will be on the number. So if we're looking here at number 2, or this number 2, or number 3, all of those items, you will get the information from your interview with a supervisor, but you should confirm that the information is accurate by actually going in and watching employees complete their task in order to confirm that all of that information is indeed accurate. This is a continuation of the resources, materials, and processes section. This is where it really gets into the materials necessary to complete the task, well designed for their intended purpose. So really asking, do the employees have the right materials for the job? The fourth and final section for data collection, there are 4 total sections, is about performance consequences, effort, and competition. This section seeks to gain an understanding about what happens after the employee completes a task, like whether they receive feedback from a supervisor. And it also asks questions about whether other tasks get in the way of each other. Additionally, there is a question regarding how much effort is required to complete the task. After you've completed data collection in your interview and doing direct observation using this tool, you will need to review the intervention planning section here to identify what interventions correlate with the sections in which problems have been identified. So remember, a no indicates there is a suggested problem, and a yes indicates there is no suggested problem. So you would look at the questions in which you marked no, and you would identify which interventions you should use based on those. Let's talk about how this process has been used in the literature. This is a table developed in a literature review by David A. Wilder regarding some background information of how the PDCHS has been used. So some of the performance problems that have been addressed using the PDCHS are cleaning tasks in an autism treatment center, closing doors in an autism treatment center, making sure staff are doing appropriate error correction procedures in schools, making sure staff are properly pricing items in a thrift store, and making sure that behavior therapists are using the correct amount of rate of opportunities in an autism treatment center. Here's an article called An Evaluation of the Performance Diagnostic Checklist Human Services to Assess an Employee Performance Problem in a Center-Based Autism Treatment Facility. It's by Kyle Ditzian, David A. Wilder, Allison King, and Janine Tance. This article will give us more information into how the PDCHS has been used and evaluated. So the purpose of this study was to examine the utility of the PDCHS by using it to assess poor securing of therapy room doors in an autism treatment center. The way they conducted this study was they evaluated the behavior of 4 therapists working in a clinic, and they gathered baseline data on how often the therapists were closing the therapy room doors. The way they gathered this data was using percentage of opportunity. So every time a therapist passed through a therapy room door, they took data on the percentage of time that they actually closed the door. In gaining information using the PDCHS, they interviewed 3 BCBAs who were supervisors in this facility. After gathering that data, they implemented 2 interventions. One intervention was identified by the PDCHS. It was individual verbal and graph feedback. So they provided feedback to the employees verbally, so by explaining whether or not they closed the therapy room door, and graphed. So they showed the employees graphs of their own behavior. The other intervention that was implemented that was not identified by the PDCHS was the arbitrary intervention of written prompts. So they essentially put a piece of paper on the door saying to close the door. And they continued gathering percentage of opportunity data on therapists passing through the therapy room doors and closing the door. These interventions were not implemented simultaneously. For 2 of the participants, they were exposed to the written prompts before being moved into the verbal and graph feedback intervention. As a result of these interventions, so the intervention identified by the PDCHS, the individual verbal and graph feedback, demonstrated significant improvement across all participants. The intervention not identified by the PDCHS, the written prompts, showed no significant improvement across all participants. So with the written prompts, the participants were closing the therapy room doors at baseline levels. This gives us some evidence into the effectiveness and utility of the PDCHS. Now, although it does sound like an ideal tool, there are some limitations. First, there's limited research on non-behavior analysts using the PDCHS. Additionally, the PDCHS has been evaluated by comparing the indicated interventions with arbitrary non-indicating interventions. An example of this is from the previous experiment. Those written prompts that were used as the comparison intervention were arbitrary. There was no suggestion that that intervention would ever be effective. So essentially, the PDCHS needs to be compared with other performance analysis tools to see whether it is truly effective. Here is a list of references for anybody interested in continuing to look further into this tool and its evaluation. Thank you all for watching.